What if I told you that in the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union orchestrated the most devastating military defeat in German history, wiping out an entire army group of 450,000 men in just 5 weeks and advancing 450 miles in a single operation? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're diving deep into Operation Bagration, the brilliant Soviet offensive that turned the tables on Nazi Germany and opened the gates to Berlin. Named after a hero who fought Napoleon, this operation was Stalin's masterstroke of revenge against the Wehrmacht. 3 years after Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa and nearly destroyed the Soviet Union, the Red Army was about to demonstrate that they had not only learned from their defeats but had surpassed their former masters in the art of warfare. So grab your coffee, smash that like button, and let's explore how Soviet military genius created Germany's worst nightmare and changed the course of World War II forever. To understand Bagration, we need to go back to early 1944. The German army was reeling from catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad, Kursk, and the liberation of Ukraine, losing over 1 million men in the previous year alone. However, Army Group Center had remained relatively stable in its positions across Belarus and eastern Poland, creating what German commanders believed was an impregnable fortress protecting the approaches to Warsaw and Berlin. The spring of 1944 had seen Soviet forces achieve major victories on other sectors of the front, liberating Crimea. The Soviets threw everything they had into preparing for Bagration, making it the largest and most sophisticated military operation in their history. They concentrated over 1.4 million men, 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 24,000 artillery pieces, and 6,000 aircraft for the offensive. This represented not just the largest concentration of Soviet military power in the entire war, but possibly the largest concentration of combat power ever assembled for a single operation. Stalin personally oversaw the planning process throughout spring 1944, working directly with his most experienced commanders including Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky. The operation required unprecedented coordination between 4 separate fronts: the 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Belarusian fronts, each with its own specific objectives and timetables that had to mesh perfectly with the others. The Soviets introduced the most sophisticated deception operation of the war, known as Maskirovka. Fake radio traffic, dummy tank formations, and carefully orchestrated troop movements were designed to convince German intelligence that the main Soviet summer offensive would target Army Group North Ukraine, hundreds of miles south of the actual attack zone. Soviet engineers even constructed fake bridges and supply depots in the south while secretly building the real infrastructure for Bagration in the north. The artillery preparation was unlike anything previously seen in warfare. The Red Army assembled more guns per mile of front than at any previous battle, with some critical sectors having 1 artillery piece for every 4 meters of frontage. Soviet planners calculated that they could fire over 2.5 million shells in the opening bombardment alone, more explosive power than had been used in entire previous campaigns. Perhaps most impressively, Soviet logistics performed miracles of organization and secrecy. Entire tank armies were moved hundreds of miles without German reconnaissance detecting the movements. The Red Army had learned to conduct operations at night, camouflage their positions during the day, and maintain radio silence that prevented German signals intelligence from tracking Soviet preparations. What made Bagration different from all previous Soviet offensives was the level of tactical sophistication involved. This wasn't the crude frontal assault of earlier years. Soviet commanders had studied German tactics, learned from their own mistakes, and developed operational concepts that would have impressed Prussian staff officers. The Red Army of 1944 was a completely different force from the one that had been surprised and nearly destroyed in 1941. The German response to intelligence about possible Soviet offensive preparations was not just inadequate, it was tragically misguided on multiple levels. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, had become overconfident after holding their positions for nearly 3 years. They had convinced themselves that their fortress cities were impregnable and that Soviet forces lacked the capability to coordinate large-scale offensive operations. German forces in the region totaled about 800,000 men organized into the 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Army, and 9th Army. However, these formations were severely understrengthened after years of continuous combat, with many divisions consisting of barely 8,000 men instead of their authorized 17,000. More critically, most units had been stripped of their experienced officers and NCOs, who had been transferred to other fronts or had become casualties in previous battles. German defensive preparations were based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about Soviet capabilities and intentions. They continued to rely on static defensive concepts that had been obsolete since 1942, constructing elaborate fortifications around key cities while neglecting mobile reserves and flexible response capabilities. Hitler's rigid doctrine of holding every position at all costs meant that German commanders were forbidden from conducting strategic withdrawals that might have saved their forces. The fortress cities that anchored German defenses Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk were indeed heavily fortified, but their garrisons were inadequate and their supply lines vulnerable. German engineers had spent months strengthening these positions, but they had failed to account for the possibility that Soviet forces might simply bypass them and attack their rear communications. German intelligence failures were comprehensive and systematic. Not only did they misidentify the location of the coming Soviet offensive, but they also severely underestimated Soviet capabilities and the scale of forces being assembled. German aerial reconnaissance was severely limited by Soviet air superiority, while German agents behind Soviet lines had been systematically eliminated by NKVD counterintelligence operations. Perhaps most critically, German command structure was poorly suited to respond to the kind of multi-front coordinated offensive that the Soviets were planning. Authority was fragmented between competing headquarters, while Hitler's insistence on micromanaging tactical decisions from Berlin meant that local commanders couldn't respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The Wehrmacht that had once been famous for its flexibility and initiative had become bureaucratic and rigid. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, Operation Bagration commenced with the largest artillery bombardment in Soviet history. Over 24,000 guns opened fire simultaneously across the entire front, creating a wall of explosions that could be heard hundreds of miles away. The northern attacks by the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts immediately achieved breakthrough success. Soviet forces smashed through German defensive lines that had been considered impregnable, advancing faster than German commanders could react. The fortress city of Vitebsk was surrounded within 48 hours. The speed of Soviet advance was unprecedented. Tank armies that had been held in reserve poured through gaps in German lines, advancing 30 to 40 miles per day and cutting German communication lines. German units found themselves isolated and under attack from multiple directions before they could organize coherent defense. In the center, the 2nd Belarusian front achieved similar success around Mogilev, while the 1st Belarusian front advanced toward Bobruisk. German defenders, expecting to fight from prepared positions, instead found themselves surrounded and forced to fight their way out of rapidly closing encirclements. The German response was confused and ineffective. Orders from Hitler to hold all positions conflicted with tactical reality on the ground, while communication breakdowns prevented coordinated responses to Soviet breakthroughs. German reserves, positioned to counter expected attacks elsewhere, were too far away to influence the battle. By June 27, the Soviet offensive had achieved its most spectacular success with the complete encirclement of German Fourth Army near Minsk. This formation, numbering over 100,000 men, found itself trapped in a pocket with no hope of relief or escape. Soviet tank spearheads had advanced so rapidly that they cut German retreat routes before most units realized they were in danger. The 5th Guards Tank Army and 2nd Guards Tank Corps executed a perfect pincer movement, meeting east of Minsk and sealing the fate of everything inside the pocket. The destruction of 4th Army was systematic and complete. Soviet forces eliminated German positions one by one, using their overwhelming superiority in artillery and aircraft to reduce strongpoints. German attempts to break out were met by carefully prepared defensive positions and counterattacks. The fighting around Minsk demonstrated the evolution of Soviet military capabilities since the dark days of 1941. Red Army units now displayed tactical sophistication that matched their German opponents, while Soviet logistics kept attacking forces supplied even during rapid advances across hundreds of miles. More importantly, the Minsk encirclement proved that the Soviets had mastered the art of mobile warfare. The same techniques that Germans had used so effectively in the early war years were now being turned against them by an enemy that had learned from defeat and emerged stronger. By July 1st, it was clear that Army Group Center had suffered the greatest defeat in German military history. Entire divisions had been wiped out, while survivors were scattered across hundreds of miles of territory now controlled by advancing Soviet forces. But the Soviets weren't finished. Throughout July, Red Army forces continued their advance, liberating Minsk, crossing into Poland, and approaching the gates of Warsaw. The rapid Soviet advance created a gap in German lines that stretched from the Baltic to the Carpathian Mountains. The German response was to commit reserves from other sectors, but these forces were insufficient to restore a coherent defense line. Units rushed from France, Italy and other army groups were thrown into battle piecemeal and achieved little except to increase German casualties. What made the Soviet success so complete was their ability to maintain momentum. Unlike previous offensives that had stalled after initial success, Bagration continued for 5 full weeks, advancing deeper into German-held territory with each passing day and eliminating German resistance across an area larger than France. The psychological impact was devastating for German forces. Soldiers who had been told that Army Group Center was impregnable instead found themselves in headlong retreat across territory they had occupied for 3 years. Meanwhile, Soviet confidence soared as the Red Army demonstrated its ability to conduct the most sophisticated military operations. Operation Bagration was Nazi Germany's greatest military disaster, surpassing even Stalingrad in its scope and strategic consequences. German casualties were staggering, around 450,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, representing the complete destruction of 17 divisions and severe damage to 50 others. More importantly, Army Group Center simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, leaving a gap in German lines that stretched from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The loss of experienced leadership was particularly catastrophic for German forces. Field Marshal Busch was dismissed in disgrace, while dozens of division and corps commanders were killed or captured during the Soviet advance. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, who temporarily commanded 4th Army, later described Bagration as the greatest defeat of German arms since 1806. These officers represented decades of military experience and institutional knowledge that could never be replaced. Soviet casualties were remarkably light considering the magnitude of their achievement. Approximately 180,000 men lost while advancing 450 miles and liberating territory containing millions of civilians. This efficiency ratio demonstrated how far Soviet military art had evolved since the costly frontal assaults of 1941–42. The Red Army had learned to achieve decisive results through superior planning and coordination rather than just overwhelming numbers. The strategic implications were immediate and irreversible. Bagration eliminated the last major German defensive position on the Eastern Front and opened multiple routes toward Germany itself. Within 6 weeks of the offensive's launch, Soviet spearheads were approaching Warsaw, while other formations had advanced to the Baltic coast, cutting off German forces in the Baltic states. The operation also demonstrated the complete maturation of Soviet military leadership and doctrine. Commanders like Rokossovsky, Cherniakovsky, and Bagramyan had displayed strategic vision and tactical execution that surpassed anything achieved by German generals during the same period. Soviet staff work, logistics, and inter-service cooperation had reached levels of sophistication that their opponents could no longer match. International reactions to Bagration were profound and immediate. Churchill described it as incomparably the greatest victory achieved by any of the Allies, while American military observers were stunned by the scale and speed of Soviet success. Even German propaganda, usually adept at spinning military disasters, found it impossible to present Bagration as anything other than a catastrophic defeat. Operation Bagration represents the pinnacle of Soviet military achievement and one of the most brilliant strategic operations in military history. Stalin's gamble on a massive coordinated offensive had succeeded beyond all expectations, fundamentally altering not just the strategic balance of World War II but demonstrating that the Red Army had evolved into the most sophisticated military force in the world. The success of Soviet Maskirovka cannot be overstated in its importance to the operation's success. By convincing German intelligence that the main offensive would come elsewhere, Soviet planners achieved complete tactical and operational surprise despite assembling the largest military force in their nation's history. This deception campaign was so effective that German reserves were positioned hundreds of miles from where they were actually needed. From a broader historical perspective, Bagration marked the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Never again would German forces launch a major offensive operation, and every subsequent German action would be reactive, desperate, and ultimately futile. The operation demonstrated that the USSR had not only recovered from the disasters of 1941 but had surpassed their former capabilities. The human cost of Bagration, while significant for the Soviets, represented unprecedented efficiency in achieving strategic objectives. The ratio of Soviet casualties to territorial gained and enemy forces destroyed was better than any comparable operation in military history. This efficiency reflected the maturation of Soviet military leadership and their mastery of operational art. The lessons of Bagration extend beyond World War II. It showed that victory goes to the side that can best coordinate multiple complex operations simultaneously while maintaining operational security. The Soviets had superior planning, better intelligence, and clearer strategic objectives than their German opponents. What aspects of Operation Bagration surprised you most? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world.